Thank you for joining us for this timely conversation on Argentina's debt negotiation. Tweets while watching this event using the hashtag ACArgentina. You can also post questions in the us. For those who live in the Washington area, it would be coming to this discussion in person. So we'll just have to save that for another time. The pandemic and its health and socioeconomic implications, the Argentine government is also in negotiation with creditors to restructure its outstanding debts. Final restructuring offer for $65 billion in debt. August 4th is now the new deadline for creditors to accept this offer. Just last night, the government has get closer to creditor demands over the last few months for greater fiscal space to reach a favorable agreement. Creditors, with one particular group last week reacted to the latest offer, are seeking a smaller haircut and shorter deal will determine the fate of the country's long-term finances and the trajectory of the Argentine of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center's Advisory Council. Jerry?
Thank you, Jason. And as you mentioned, this is a very timely conversation in a moment of exceptional challenge for Argentina. Argentina was already facing economic hardships prior to COVID, and COVID exacerbates even more those difficulties. So here we have a panel of three individuals that I highly respect. And I'm going to start introducing Martin. Martin Redrado was president of Argentina's Central Bank from 2004 to 2010. He's also the founder of Fundación Capital, a leading economic research and public think tank in Argentina. So welcome, Martin. Good to have you here again.
Pleasure.
And joining us today also is Carlos Melconian. Carlos was president of Banco de la Nación Argentina from 2015 to 2017. He's also the co-founder of MacroView SA, a consulting firm with a vast track record dedicated to Argentinians and global economic analysis. So thank you, Carlos, as well. And
last pleasure too. Thank you.
Last but not least, my friend Lisa Schindler. She is the managing director for S&P Global Ratings. She is responsible for sovereign ratings across Latin America. She's a very good friend of the Adrian Arch Center, Latin American Center, and she's a very good friend of mine. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to you guys, and then we will be open for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Jerry. And seconding your welcome of Carlos, Martin, and Lisa. Great to have you all, and thank you for doing this. And Jerry, it's always great to have you join us. We're going to talk in the next 30, 40 minutes on a couple of different issues. We'll talk about the debt negotiation process itself and where we stand, the impact on Argentine people and businesses, and then also look a bit beyond whether it's a deal or no deal, but look at fiscal health and economic recovery. Martin, I'd like to start off with you to get the honor of the first question here. And I'd like to start off with you providing, contextualize a little bit more how Argentina got to this point. I'm sure most of the people who are listening are very familiar. But if you could look at how the country ended up in the midst of an incredibly tense debt negotiation, as well as doing so in the middle of a global pandemic. And Martin, you have to take yourself off of mute, please.
Thank you, Jason. It's a great pleasure and honor to be sharing this panel with all the distinguished panelists that we have. In a nutshell, the Argentinian economy has been in stagflation during the last 10 years. And when we look at the 2010, 2015, basically it was a period where expenditures were based on the capacity that the central bank had at that point because there were 50 billion of liquid reserves. In the period of 2015, 2019, nothing was changed about the Argentinian economy. And what could say is what led us to this debt negotiation is the lack of a comprehensive general equilibrium macroeconomic program that will put in place first a price stabilization as a first goal, and secondly to generate the reforms, the competitive reforms that Argentina needs in order to have sustainable growth. Not looking back to the past 10 years, but looking forward to 2030, we have developed with my team a framework of analysis that says what will it take for the Argentinian economy to have a sustainable and permanent and consistent growth of 3.5% per year, with a downward inflation to be probably at the mid of that period, 2025, in a single digit. What it will take basically to move the ratio of investment to GDP from 14% to 21%, and the ratio of exports to GDP from 13% to 18%. To do that, you need a comprehensive macroeconomic program, a monetary program, a fiscal program, a reform program that gives a horizon to the Argentinian economy that it doesn't have. Now, let's come specifically to the debt situation. Unfortunately, the new government, instead of putting the concept of launching an economic program that would give a horizon to the Argentine investors and to the Argentine population and also to foreign investors, instead it decided to put the concept of a debt renegotiation first and the program second. And in my view, it put the cart in front of the horse. We wouldn't be discussing 3, 4, 5 cents on the dollar as we are at this point if we would have had an economic program that will assure that the exit yield on Argentina will be, rather than 10%, will be 8%, or moving into a 6-7% rate, where Argentina should be, given also this context of zero interest rates. Yeah. So the government took this approach of launching the debt renegotiation. Unfortunately, I would say a lot of time was lost at the beginning discussing a debt sustainability analysis that was launched at the beginning of March. Debt sustainability analysis that had a lot of hypotheses, that in particular, a lot of assumptions that in particular are very weak at this point, where we have a pandemic and where parameters are changing on a day-by-day basis. So instead of engaging our creditors in a substantive, in a constructive dialogue, we got immersed into the details of a debt sustainability analysis that had a lot of assumptions that were really meaningless in terms of the negotiation. So that led us to, yes, let me
Thank you, Martin. Very, very great context, and I think we'll also get more into what needs to happen in the future, as you're describing as well, looking ahead to 2030, which is so important. Lisa, the S&P downgraded Argentina recently. I believe at the end of last month, a downgrade for Argentina. In the midst of this debt negotiation process, which Martin was describing, how have markets, how have investors reacted to this process, and where does the sentiment of the community now as we have this latest offer on the table?
Sure. I want to clarify that we downgraded the foreign currency rating actually early in May, the anchor, so to speak, for our bond issue ratings, when the government at that point issued a decree postponing payment of local law dollar paper through the end of the year, pending renegotiation of the foreign law, international law bonds, which are currently underway. We, at the end of May, we put the first international law bonds to D. As the grace period expired, they weren't paid. And we continued to put bonds issues to D since then, including today, when there has been non-payment of any principal or coupon payment during that time frame. I think the process is not a surprise that we're in this process, given the signaling from the Macri administration, that given post the Paso, the default that we had at the end of August, the signals on longer term, not just short term, but long term debt renegotiation by likely the initiatives put forward by them, and then currently under the given the Fernandez-Candesi administration. I think the negotiation process, it's not surprising that it's been challenging. I think these kind of negotiations are always challenging. I think there's been a fundamental difference, I think, between both various bondholders versus the government, and within the bondholder community is how much of it, to what degree is a liquidity versus a solvency issue. And we've always heard from the beginning of the process that there was limited appetite from holders in terms of a large haircut, et cetera. So all of this was up for debate. And there were also concerns about how consensual the process would be. And therefore, we've had this iterative discussion going on in a very complex environment. I think, and that continues. So I think we were set up for difficult conversations, and COVID exacerbated that. I think to highlight, I think this initial plans of the government for a speedy process were always ambitious, right? And COVID and the various complications feed into that dynamic.
Carlos, thanks, Lisa. Carlos, let me shift to you, and then I want to actually bring in a question that we have over the Q&A already as part of this conversation right now. But Carlos, you've talked about, you've stated, I think, that you need to be a magician to balance the economy and the pandemic appropriately. I know myself, I'm not a magician, but what are some of the major trade-offs as you're thinking about how to balance at this critical moment? And Carlos, you take yourself off of mute, please. You're still on mute there, Carlos.
Because you got it. Sorry. Well, one more time, it's a pleasure to be here and to share with Martin and Lisa. Thank you very much for your invitation. Yes, it's true. It's true. But I like to say that so far, I don't know really if there is a country in the world that it's discovered the formula to preserve the population health and not to suffer the economy at the same time. And even more, I add additionally that I don't make a distinction between developed countries and not developed countries to separate this trade-off. That is true. The problem we said that happened in the rest of the world is more evident in urban regions, although sometimes less populated regions may suffer the consequence too. So the quarantine appeared as the key instrument, as you know, Argentina used a strict quarantine, but only to gain the time. So to try to put the health sector into shape and minimize the number of deaths. That's with the huge negative impact of the economy. Because of that, the title of my first overview related to the pandemic said that the quarantine kills the economy, the economic activity. So the middle road, the balance, it's and the inevitable trade-off related to your question is from the sanitary point of view, focalize lockdowns, powerful policy testing, tracing, isolating new cases, and individual responsibility to keep the social distancing. So in the case of Argentina, it's more difficult because we focus our main problem in the AMBA, that it's the city and the conurbano bonaerense. There's a province and 2 billion people come and go on a daily basis, and it's a problem. It's a part of the political affairs between the governor of Provincia of Buenos Aires and the mayor of the city. And from the economic point of view, the response has been to provide a huge dose of monetary and fiscal stimulus during the emergency and diminish the impact on the activity and allow fast recovery after that. And but if I have 1 minute more, So this problem in Argentina beginning before the pandemic. That's the problem. That Argentina was into emergency before the pandemic. So an additional problem was that Argentina has a lack, is a country that without domestic capital in the local currency because its society rejected the local currency. And it's obvious that we are now in the middle of negotiation with the foreign capital market financing. So as a consequence of that, the only source of the finance currently, and maybe it will be part of our meeting and our question later, is the central bank printing money. So currently the central bank will print money for around 3 trillion pesos. That's for understand. We are speaking about 9 to 10% of the GDP, and it's for 3 times the monetary base. So, because of that, I'm close my answer. In Argentina, in particular, the thing is more complicated than in other kinds of countries, such because the lack of a genuine source of finance in the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. I want to actually bring in. There's a question on the Q&A function here, which goes to actually a question I was going to put to you, Martin, but it's and others can jump in as well. But it's a simple question, but it's can Argentina afford to not reach a deal, or a tough deal that provides some relief better than no deal?
I think there is a consensus in Argentina that we need to have a deal. We have gone already into default in 2001, and we all know some people that were for that learned it the hard way in terms of the pain that it causes on the population, the increase in poverty that already with the pandemic is going to go to more than 50% of the total population. So clearly, in my view, the question is when, but not the question is if. There is also the political will to reach the deal. Of course, the issue is the dynamics on how it will move and the dynamics of the negotiation. What we cannot say at this point is when it will reach, when Argentina will reach a deal. There are actually some dates that are give you some idea that there could be more room. The fact that the deal closes on August 4, but then you have for the settlement 1 month in order to settle. There is a lot of time there. Why did the economic team leave that space of time in place? Yes, I am considering, and in the base scenario that I give to my clients is that Argentina will cut it.
And just a quick question: what is the it could be for any of the panelists, but what makes this last offer more appealing? And do panelists think that this is the president himself last night said that this is, again, reader, this is the final offer? Of course, there's a group of creditors that are looking for even more movement from the government side. Is there the potential? Is there the bandwidth? Is there the ability, or even the desire to put forward an even further revised offer, or is this? Do the panelists agree this is the final offer and there's no more maneuverability within it?
Should I go first, or?
Please.
Well, obviously you need to say that this is your last offer. And clearly you need to look not only at the debt with foreign creditors, the debt with local creditors, but also the debt with the IMF. I think that you cannot parcel out single packages, but have an overall view of what will be your debt profile as you move forward. So, for example, one thing that I would recommend in negotiating with the fund is that the cost of the package in terms of interest rate that we have in 2018 was 4.25 in a context where the Fed funds rate were 1.75, 1 3/4. You know what has happened with the cost of funding at this point worldwide and in the United States. So clearly you have more room there to negotiate what will be the cost of your refinancing with the IMF. So at this point, what you have is the capacity or not to move in terms of more dollars. I will move more on the legal situation rather than the putting more cents. I think that unfortunately the dynamic of the negotiation, we took a hard posture in terms, but a weak content. And I like negotiations where you have a hard content and a diplomatic approach, okay? Because we move from 40 cents on the dollar to 53 and we don't have a deal. So clearly we have already, in terms of what Argentina could save from now until 2028, the target was that it would save, or at least would cut cost of about $50 billion. At this point is below that with the offer that it has already done. So in my view, let's look at the overall debt situation of Argentina and the deal that we need to strike with the IMF. And secondly, more at the legal conditions at this point to get closer to cut a deal with the rest of the creditors.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jason. It's I not only agree with Martin, but I add it's better to settle an agreement improving and go forward than to enter into the fall. So in my view, it's crucial the debt arrangement to contain the macro tensions, even considering that it's not sufficient to solve the macro problems of Argentina. But it can provide certain degree of certainty to the current situation. So again, our current monetary and FX and inflationary problems would remain relevant after the agreement, but it's absolutely clear that the majority prefer the agreement in Argentina. So even considering that was too much, 7 months to settle an agreement, practically returning to the prices of at the beginning, but it's important to closure. So I like to return to some things that Martin said, that since we are going the agreement, the negotiation, now we are saving less money than the initial offer. So we will need to discuss with the IMF. So my recommendation is after the bondholders agreement, go to immediately to the IMF agreement, and we will have some noises on the DSA and GFN discussion. That is clear. So because the gross financing needs maybe will change from the first offer. But perhaps the own IMF could be modified the debt goals first, notwithstanding that at least during the first year could give to Argentina without pay net interest payments. In other words, it's a tradition that the IMF asks at least the net payments of the interest. By imagining that in the first year, and taking into account the private sector involvement coming from the bondholders, then the IMF this time could accept the first year to balance capital and interest simultaneously. So my last point here, and from the political point of view, is that maybe we need to check our relationship with the American government and the Treasury, because the importance of the Treasury on the board of the IMF, that a little bit less than 20% of the votes.
Thank you, Carlos.
Wow,
thank you. That's
sorry.
really, that's
For the next.
perfect. Great,
Okay.
great insight. I want to.
Sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. I want to pick up on a point, Lisa. The question of if the latest deal moves forward, and others can jump in afterwards. But Lisa, what are the implications for the Argentine economy? Specifically, how would compliance and Carl was just getting at this as well. But how would compliance with the terms impact also coronavirus related stimulus measures? And I think that's also tied to a question on the Q&A function, a Schrober, of the view of longer term debt sustainability, especially if the government sweetens its current offer anymore. I think Martine and Carlos, yourself, all three were saying this is the government has moved many steps forward from its initial offer. So would a even sweeter deal provide real challenges for long-term sustainability?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think the deal moving forward, it opens up the path for resolution on the broader debt management side. Fully agree with the points that Martina and Carlos highlighted. We're talking about them moving to the local law debt, local law dollar debt, and then there's the whole peso, continuing to manage the peso debt. And it's crucial that you can build sustainability for growth, it's policies, credibility, et cetera, to develop so it's a store of value. I mean, that's a key fundamental weakness that has impacted the Argentine economy and rating, et cetera. Clearly tapping in, resolving the IMF is key. All of these working through the broad debt picture, including at the provincial level. We have a number of provinces that we've lowered to default. We have restructuring there. That would be, you have to move through this before you can finish tackling those. I think the important point, irrespective of the deal, the economy is going to be really hit this year. We have a significant contraction, and we're also expecting, somewhat of a sluggish recovery. And that goes back to the point that Martine put on the table at the beginning. Now a deal will also clear up space for potential more detailed articulation of a growth plan and a strategy. Where will the foundations for growth come from over time? Is it the ag sector? What would you need in Vacuumwerk? The digital economy, usually the knowledge-based services. This is key. An articulation and policy initiatives to strengthen the growth dynamic, which has been a key weakness in Argentina and volatile, because the rating is not just the debt to debt number, it is not just the contour of that debt itself, but it's the institutional setting, the policy predictability, the growth dynamics. A more resilient, prosperous economy can support the debt dynamic, whatever debt level comes out of this negotiation, for better or for worse, right? So it really depends. Will you be able to start easing some of the FX controls or not? So all of the, I think moving beyond the deal, you can then tackle more upfront, potentially some of these other challenges, which all feed into, will growth be sustainable or not? Debt be sustainable or not over time? To what degree?
Thanks, Lisa. I want to move actually on that point to looking a little bit at the impact on the Argentine people and impact on businesses, and then get a little bit more to Martine started this from in the beginning of the conversation, looking at economic recovery. But Martine, let me shift back to you. Saying this deal really has implications on the growth plan, and we were talking earlier about the decision to negotiate the debt first, rather than focusing on the broader growth plan first. But if you could, Martina, explain a little bit about what this means to the average Argentine citizen. I mean, how does this negotiation, how does the result of it, which will either be an agreement that I think that we all collectively hope transpires, or the possibility of a default, but how does this affect the critical issues of poverty and inequality in Argentina, especially at this time of the COVID pandemic that nobody could have anticipated we'd be in the midst of while entering into these negotiations?
a no-deal situation will make worse the situation of poverty, inequality, and informality, because it will mean that Argentina will need to live on a cash basis. And as Carlos said before, the only cash that Argentina has is the printing of money of the central bank, because we are also with a level of net reserves or liquid reserves at the central bank, which are a little bit more of $8 billion. If you take into consideration the gold and the special drawing rights, the SDRs that are in the vaults, if I could say, of the central bank. So clearly, you are in a situation where if you are living just on cash, then the possibility of getting out of this situation will clearly be worse off. It will take more time to Argentina to get back on track. Obviously, there will be at the beginning, because of the opening up, as Carlos said at the beginning, opening up of the economy, there will be a sort of a bouncing back. But the clear issue is that we don't have just a slight bouncing back. Of course, if GDP goes down this year by 13%, it is obvious that it is going to go up, because we have already gone down 2 years before down the road. The question is, are we going to start a growth process? So in a nutshell, to reach a deal is a necessary but not sufficient condition for Argentina to get back on track. In order to have a sufficient condition, it's clearly to put a comprehensive, convergent macroeconomic plan where fiscal, monetary, and financing needs all converge into at least a four-year program with specific hurdles on a quarter-by-quarter basis, and specific reforms to make our productive sector more competitive.
Thank you, Martin. And Carlos, looking ahead as well, what do you see drilling down further on the specific sectors that could be most impacted? Let's look at even at the scenario of let's hope of a final deal, and the additional challenge that either scenario, frankly, presents for Argentina. What are some of the sectors that are going to be most affected, and what sectors are best positioned for a quicker recovery as well?
Well, so in Argentina, as happened in the rest of the world, the impact on economic activity is broad and deep. So practically, I can say that all sectors have been affected. All sectors. So, in spite of that, there are sectors that are winners, as the e-commerce and so on. All the sectors have been affected. There exist some exceptions. I call exceptions more than winners. Exceptions such as the farmers, food industry, supermarkets, banks, insurance company, and it's obvious, the public sector itself. So the sectors directly related to foreign trade, credit, tourism, entertainment, and many other sectors involved of a massive movement of people and trade are the most affected ones. From the macro point of view, your question, it's within an impact on the 2020 GDP in our forecast of 12 or more, 14, minus 14%. So returning our GDP per capita levels to 1999, that's a big problem. And we need to add that related to the departure after the crisis, we are not expecting a V departure in Argentina. in our forecast, as happened in the two old experiences in 1999 during the hyperinflation and 2001 after the Corralito financial crisis. So those two experiences began with a deep recession and stagflation and so on, as happened now. But the departure was, on one side, an absolute change of regime under Mr. President, under President Menem administration. Was a complete change of regime. Capitalism, privatizations, the currency board regime was absolutely different. The V departure at that time. And in the best decade of the 2000 was under President Kirchner administration, the V departure. We are neither expecting of change of regime nor expecting the best decade again for Latin America. Because of that, it be difficult to return to the pre-crisis level. The recovery will be sluggish, fragile, and a complex macroeconomic context. But finishing the idea and returning to your question, those sectors of industrial and non-traditional exports, Brazilian dependent consumer goods sectors linked to informal workers, which demand are very affected by a sector to do sanitary restrictions that depend on the investment and so on. I'm sure those will be the most affected sectors.
Yeah. Thank you, Carlos. And looking at those sectors, but then also looking at, I think a key question is investor confidence in Argentina. And more broadly, and Martina, I'll start off with this question to you, and maybe others want to jump in as well. But let's look even beyond a deal. Even let's assume a deal is made, and looking beyond that, what are going to be some of the important points to convince investors that Argentina is a safe investment with sufficient returns? And I also want to add in there a question from the Q&A function from Kezia McCaig here on investor confidence in Argentina. My question, but pairing that as well with the views of some of the recent economic policy decisions that have been made. She referenced here in the Q&A the Vicentin takeover, the stricter export controls, the continuation of price freezes. So how does the current debt negotiation discussion combined with other recent economic policy decisions impact the investment climate, and what will be needed to generate greater investment into Argentina moving forward?
Argentina needs a macroeconomic program in place after the debt negotiation is over. And what we mean by that is basically when you lose confidence, as it is the case of Argentina, we can say when, but clearly we are in a crisis of confidence. What you need to establish is a long-term program, but with short-term goals, so that you reconstruct that confidence with goals that you set on a quarter-by-quarter basis in the monetary front, in the fiscal front, in the investment side in terms of public sector investment. And clearly, Argentina, what you need is, in my view, a pluriannual approach in terms of how do we reach a process of fiscal normality after this abnormality that we had this year. We are going to have a public sector deficit of 7.5% of GDP, and that's clearly unsustainable. If you want also to finance it, you cannot continue to finance it with printing money from the central bank. So what you need to put in place is a stabilization program that lowers the nominality of the key variables that the Argentine government is facing. I would like to have, in particular, a consensus in Congress where you could have a pluriannual approach, say a 4-year fiscal program that is voted both by the official government and by the opposition. So in order to restore confidence, it is critical that you could have the backing to say, well, Argentina is finally taking the route of going in this direction, and so that all of us, the investor community, is clear of where is the north of the Argentinian economy. Of course, in this situation, you need to put also a tax reform, but a tax reform that tackles informality. And this is the case not only for Argentina, but for the rest of Latin America. One of the key aspects that the pandemic has put in place is the lack of specific reforms that our governments have done in order to fight informality. We cannot have 40% of the population without any sort of social coverage, and that's why we need to have a tax system that lowers the tax rates but widens the tax basis, and to be also more federalist in terms of having the provinces more responsibility in raising their own taxes. So a comprehensive tax reform that also gives incentives to investment, but it's clear that whatever the best macroeconomic program you could have in place, you need to have political support from Congress to show that Argentina is finally going into one direction and that there will not be any shift in terms of we are looking to a more competitive economy, a more responsible economy from a fiscal monetary point of view, and that's why the backing of Congress is critical from the opposition and from the official government.
Thank you, Martin. We're just out of time here, but Lisa, I want to give you a chance to have a final word here before we close the program.
Sure. I think the key here again is also for the economy success, for the broader population, it's policy credibility and consistency over changes of governments. That's been a key weakness in the rating. I think, and the Vicentin example is emblematic of changes in rules of the game. We're in the crisis. There may be very important reasons why the action was taken, notwithstanding controversy about it, but it's more emblematic. It brings up it represents a track record of changes in fiscal policy, the inflation dynamic. You need a consistent macro and micro approach, exactly along the lines that Martin highlighted, that can generate prosperity over time to generate political buy-in across the population, across party lines, to underpin prosperity, which then would, of course, support a higher rating.
I think we probably could have spent another hour. There's a number of other questions on the Q&A function. Of course, a lot of interest, Martin, Carlos, and Lisa, in your analysis at this critical moment. And I want to thank all three of you and Jerry Matzo, the chair of our advisory council, who introduced you, for your participation today at this critical moment. Thank everybody for joining us. And again, I'm sorry that we weren't able to serve empanadas. Maybe next time, along with Alpha Horace, we'll be able to do that. We'll continue from the Atlantic Council Adrian Arch Latin America Center to be closely following these discussions, and especially as we look for new opportunities to promote even deeper ties between the U.S. and Argentina. So thank you all for joining us, and look forward to the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
Thank you. Hay que traer